Politik.
Ekonomika.
Skikka.
Geros.
Mezhab.
Bunka.
Helped. Casey.
Ambient. Sports.
Kanker.
Tradities. Discriminering. Mozaam.
Opwarming van de aarde. The global city.
The global city.
The global city.
The global city.
Local voices, international perspectives.
Welcome to the Global City. From Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada, I'm Charlotte Arnold.
And I'm Katie. We're a group of journalism and media production students working with universities around the world to produce live shows on current issues.
Good morning from Australia. I'm Rebecca Powell, joining you from the University of Queensland in Brisbane.
The crisis in Syria is one of the most widely discussed conflicts today. With over 11 million Syrians displaced, it represents the largest migration of people since the Second World War.
At least 250,000 Syrians have died in the conflict, which began back in March 2011. Government crackdowns on pro-democracy protesters was a catalyst to 4 years of civil unrest. The instability created opportunities for terror groups, including the Islamic State, to move in and further force people from their homes.
Governments around the world are taking a stand. Countries including Canada and our government here in Australia are creating refugee policies to help Syrians caught in the crisis. On the 9th of September 2015, the Australian government announced that it will make an extra 12,000 humanitarian program places available, specifically for migrants from Syria and Iraq. These places are in addition to the existing refugee intake of 13,750.
Here in Canada, our newly minted Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is promising to bring 25,000 Syrian refugees into the country before March.
In order to qualify as one of these refugees, you must meet certain criteria. One of our reporters spoke with immigration lawyer Shelley Levine to learn more about the process.
The process for obtaining refugee status at a tribunal hearing requires the board member to hear evidence that the claimant gives in order for the claimant to establish that they fit the convention definition, which is a very specific definition as to what basis for fearing returning to their country they have. The Immigration Refugee Protection Act defines what a convention refugee is. It would basically be a person who fears persecution in their home country as a result of things like their political opinion or their religion, their membership in a particular social group, and so on. So there's a very set definition of what a convention refugee is. And for example, a person that has fled, Bangladesh is a country that often suffers from flooding, a natural disaster, almost annual natural disaster that occurs in that country. That's not the kind of refugee that the convention protects. The convention protects people against man-made problems. So Canada has recognized convention refugees and has set up a variety of ways that refugee claimants can make their claims. Refugee claimants that can make their claims when they arrive at our port of entry, or they can actually make inland claims as well. The next way that refugees are accepted into the country is by Canada actually going overseas, and we choose individuals that we think would be suitable, and they are brought back into the country as convention refugees. The other process that we're hearing a lot about in the news is sponsorships. So Canada has allowed different kinds of groups that can come forward to sponsor refugees. When these kinds of sponsorships are done, they're called private because it's not directly through the government, but there's often programs that involve both the government and these private groups that work in tandem to bring refugees over to Canada, and we're seeing that in the case of the Syrian refugees.
So Rebecca, Levine in that clip there, he mentions that, that refugees can be privately sponsored. So here in Canada, the majority of the refugees that are coming in are privately sponsored. I think it's like over or about 60% of them that are coming in. I'm just wondering what's the case in Australia?
In Australia, most of the refugees that come out are eligible for the same sort of social security funding that Australian citizens are eligible. So they come out here and they get full medical support, they get accommodation provided, and they also get weekly payments from the government, provided that they go through English language services. Sponsorship in Australia is generally reserved for the skilled migrants as opposed to refugees. I think it sounds like a really interesting system, but I don't know that it's one that we really incorporate or even advertise much in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like a really important question about this entire process is what the right balance is to strike between government and private sponsorship. And I believe we will look into that later on. Those who successfully passed the test to gain refugee status in Canada, as Levine described, are already beginning to arrive. Katie spoke with one of our newest fellow countrymen. Katie?
Yes, I did. His name is Hani Amalia, and he had been in Canada for 5 months when we caught up with him. But Hani grew up in Homs, Syria. Homs, Syria was once a bustling industrial center, but it was the site of some of the most violent attacks between the Syrian military and opposition forces. Hani is a gifted photographer, despite being legally blind. Meet Hani.
Whereabouts in Syria did you grow up?
The city was Homs, and yeah, I grew up there as a normal child that have everything that he wants, and education, and family, and friends, and we used to have a very, very normal, good life. I grew up in a middle class family.
So you graduated, and within that same month, you ended up.
I graduated in 2012, and then after a month, I was trying to set up my papers to go to the university, and then I forced to flee my country, and I find myself instead of the university in a camp.
So take me back to that moment. You had just graduated, and that moment that you found out that you had to leave.
It was a family decision. My father said that you are not safe here anymore because of my age. They want to send me to the army, but I don't want to participate in that war because it's not mine, and I would prefer to flee. So I get the diploma with my clothes and flee.
And what did you leave behind?
Everything. Everything that I achieved. I told you what I took, so you can have another idea about that. It's burned, but it was burned and destroyed, but I'm not sure that there's something exists anymore from those things. So just memories. And that will teach you about life, what's valuable, what is not for you.
Young people here in Canada, we can't even begin to imagine what it's like to live in a refugee camp. So can you describe it a little bit for us? What was life like there?
The living room is the bedroom and the kitchen. There is no electricity sometimes, no internet, nothing. And the water also. We used to carry the water from long distance. But the value was that there was people with master degrees, there was people with PhD, there was people with a lot of knowledge,
right?
But they couldn't share it with people like, with other people.
If you can just take me back to that moment when you found out that you were actually coming, that you were leaving the refugee camp and you were coming to Canada. How did you feel in that moment?
It was so a lot of joy and a lot of fear at the same time. Like, new life maybe that's coming through. It's real now, and so excited. And it's and also it's something that, well, as a refugee, you hadn't to rap for a while. So now I'm trying to get it to remember my normal life.
So what are your plans here now that you're here?
I'm planning to get a chance to go to university and reach that goals and do whatever I want and build my life that I always hoped for.
Is there anything else that you want people to know about your experience?
Refugees are not people from the moon. They are just people who interrupt, and they want to find something to recover the life that they had, something that could happen in any moment. You can find yourself in a different place without all of the things that you had before. If you can help refugees, don't ignore what they have been through. That's what I want to say.
Do you miss your life in Syria?
Yeah, I miss my life. I miss my friends. But I'm a believer of something that if you find yourself in a place, this is your home.
I think I speak for both of us when I say that that was a really incredible interview, and what you saw there barely scratches the surface. So to learn more about Hani's journey and how his passion for the arts has helped him thrive in wartime and beyond, check out the extended interview on theglobalcity.org.
Rebecca, during that interview, we were struck by one phrase that Hani kept on repeating. That phrase was that refugees are normal people, interrupted. So we're just wondering how sympathetic Australians are to refugees. Do they see the incoming Syrians as Hani described them? That is, just as normal people pulled out of their daily lives by something so out of their control, or how do they see them?
I think that's a really good question, and I believe that most young Australians do recognise that. For the most part, young Australians have really welcomed the new migrants into the community with open arms. But I feel like there's a bit of a divide here between the young Australians and kind of the older generations, because for a really long time in Australia, we actually had a policy called the White Australia policy, and that wasn't even abolished or dismantled until like the mid-1970s. So there's this existing sort of hesitation to welcoming refugees, especially those who look visibly different, as opposed to people from Europe and that sort of migrant. So there's this weird kind of dynamic where young people really do understand that this is the way the world is headed. Increased transportation and ease of mobility in the world has kind of meant that people are going to move around, and refugees are going to, they have a right to flee their country, but whether the older generations feel the same way is questionable. So I caught up with some local young Australians to see what they had to say about the new refugees. So let's check it out.
I think that that's great. I also think that we could be doing more. Obviously, offshore processing, there's huge issues with that. We don't know what's going on over there. And I think Australia needs to do a lot more in terms of safety, and not just security of our country, but the safety of all people trying to seek asylum in Australia, because Australia prides itself on being an open society, but whether that is a reality and whether the Australian government can see that through, it will be the question after we welcome these 12,000 extra refugees.
I think it's a good decision to welcome more of them. I mean, we don't do enough, do we? I think from what I've heard, we're not accepting as many as we should be, as we agreed to back in the day, something like that, yeah. So more the merrier, I'd say, yeah.
I think that every country, of course, wants to preserve the welfare of the country, but we should be kind of flexible with the international situation. So I think that definitely Australia can and have to welcome more refugees.
I think that's a kind move. That's very kind for Australia.
Oh, it's all well and good. It's just like, how are they going to pay for it?
Do you think the government is doing enough?
Yeah, I suppose. Like, it takes them a pretty long time to get here anyway. Like, it's pretty out of the way, but I guess that's what they can do.
It's way more enough for now just to let them in, because you can just provide a shelter for them. That's good enough. And, well, we can see, or the Australian government can see what they can do after that. Yeah.
And if we are offering a safe haven for these people, then it should be a place where they are free of religious and racial vilification. I think Australia really needs to address those things and actually have a look at how it treats its First Nations people before we start dictating the values that people escaping war zones should have to take on.
Now, Rebecca, we want to talk about that clip of yours. Before we do, we also took to the streets the day after our first flight of the refugees arrived in Toronto.
Here's what people had to say.
I'm so happy that we're so open to Syrian refugees and that we're accepting them, and I want to accept more. I think we should do everything we can to help.
I'm happy for them, and I'm wishing more come over.
I'm really glad we're taking them in, and I think we're one of the few countries that is so welcoming.
I trust that the government will do proper background checks and proper screenings. I'm not super concerned about safety.
The government has run so many tests on them, and like if they're going to be brought into our country, I think they're not going to be worried about us. They're going to be worried about themselves, and I think we'll be fine. I'm so sorry for what you've been through, and you're going to be safe now. Don't worry. It's not like over there. You're going to be fine.
If they come here, they're going to find peace, they're going to find life.
I would do anything I could to make them feel welcomed and safe.
The global city. The global city.
The global city. The global city.
Local voices, international perspectives.
You're watching The Global City, a show produced by students at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada, and the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. Our conversation about the Syrian refugee crisis continues. So, Rebecca, something that struck me in the conversations that you had on the street with people is that they raised the, I think, very common concern that before we help people coming from other countries, maybe it's time to acknowledge sort of what we're doing for our First Nations people. One thing I've heard in the news mentioned in Canada is that we've got a homeless issue in many of our big cities. So how important do you think it is to address those, like how do you strike that balance as well?
Yeah, it's definitely worth addressing. We obviously have our own issues here in Australia with like unemployment rates and other sort of minority groups. But one thing that really is significant, especially in regard to this refugee crisis, is we also have, prior to the arrivals of the Syrians via aircraft, we have a lot of refugees who have come by boat and they're considered illegal immigrants. And in a lot of those cases, there are in fact other Syrian refugees, except because of how they arrived here and because they're not covered by the new quota, they're going to stay in detention centres. They don't have the same privileges as what the new refugees have, and I guess you really need to question whether these refugees they should have the same rights as the legal intake now. But that's something that really needs to be addressed here, along with a number of other issues regarding minorities and other smaller groups.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that I think needs to be addressed was one that one of the girls who you interviewed on the street brought up, which was, how are we going to pay for this? I think that's something that we as young people, we don't really think about. We say, oh, okay, you know, it's so great that we're bringing in all these people and the more the merrier. But I think that's a really important conversation to have, is the whole logistics of it all.
Yeah, I found interviewing people on the street especially, it was really hard to get people to stop because a lot of people don't understand or like fully comprehend the extremity of the situation. And whilst all of the responses are really positive, which is fantastic, like if you're going to have any kind of uninformed reaction, it should be positive. But I don't think that people really know what's going on. We have a situation here where, I mean, if you imagine that you're a refugee going to somewhere where you don't speak the same language, you maybe have a different religion, you're used to a different style of living, there's all these issues. So it's great to say, yeah, come, we've got open arms for you, but there's all these smaller issues that people aren't really taking into account. For sure, I don't know how it is in Canada, but even something like water safety in Australia. And I don't mean in terms of purification, but we have a lot of beaches and swimming pools, and most people, especially from Middle Eastern countries, don't know how to swim. I mean, there's so many smaller issues that I think we really need to inform ourselves with, for sure.
Yeah, I think those are all of those little factors that we don't, when people fall down on one side of the, or the other of the issue, it's hard to imagine, like you said, something as common as learning how to swim. So because of that, it's really important to ensure that people have safety nets or at least a support system in a cultural way, in a community sense. So it's been good for us to see how various charities and NGOs are stepping up to the plate. Luckily, of these countless organizations poised to help new Canadian citizens navigate life in this country, there are also organizations in place to educate Canadians about the influx of how refugees will or won't affect their lives and their jobs. We caught up with Dana Wagner from Ryerson University's Global Diversity Exchange to learn more about these barriers to employment.
We are a research institute that began in September 2014, so we're just over a year old. So the Global Diversity Exchange, we focus on everything to do with diversity and prosperity. One is all around diversity in leadership and governance. A second big area is really where integration hits the ground with a focus on cities. And then third is our focus on employment and entrepreneurship. And that's where the program that I manage comes in, Hire Immigrants. So Hire Immigrants itself is a program, it's an online-based program primarily, and it is a platform for employers. So to give you an idea of some of the hard data, the evidence that we have about this, there was a fascinating study that recently came out in Germany that was conducted by a research institute in Germany, and they polled German employers to ask really about their perceptions of refugee employment and the likelihood of refugees in Germany actually getting employment. And what that study revealed was that employers had a really low perception of the employability of refugees. And so overwhelmingly, employers thought it was much more likely for refugees to enter unskilled work. What refugees coming into Germany bring with them is different than that picture. So you've got the perception of refugees as unskilled, but in reality, refugees are coming in and they represent all types of skill levels. Anecdotally, we also know that one of the barriers that refugees will face getting employment is the understanding of their status and their ability to work. So we know that there is confusion, not just among employers in the private sector, but among all Canadians, certainly in general, about whether refugees can actually work and what their legal status is in Canada. So it's really important to be communicating properly about not only the skill level that people are coming in with, but their ability to work from day one. So we know that resettled refugees, they come to Canada as permanent residents, which means they work and have many of the same rights as the rest of us. So an interesting statistic about refugees, what we know is that they start businesses at a much lower rate than other immigrants to Canada. That doesn't mean that they're any less entrepreneurial. There could be other reasons why, for instance, some of our settlement support may not be tailored to their needs. So it doesn't mean they're less entrepreneurial, but we do know that they start businesses at a lower rate than other immigrants. So the current group of refugees in Canada, I suppose the answer would be that self-employment is not, as a group, it's not extremely integral to their success. One really interesting area of research is looking at breaking down the myth of immigrants as job stealers. And so there's a lot of interesting evidence that shows that when immigrants come into an economy, instead of actually taking the jobs of native workers, the jobs that immigrants come into actually push the native workers into more complex work and results in higher earnings for native workers. So that's an incredible piece of evidence that really shows the real benefit of immigration. So overall, yes, immigration is integral, and the more we have, the better.
The global city. The global city.
The global city. The global city.
Local voices, international perspectives.
This is The Global City, a show produced by students at 10 countries around the world. This episode is coming to you from Ryerson University in Toronto and the University of Queensland in Brisbane. Our conversation about the Syrian refugee crisis continues. I'm Rebecca Powell from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia.
And I'm Charlotte Arnold, along with Katie Ruskina at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. We were just talking about the barriers that refugees face when relocating to a new country, and obviously one of the most pressing and integral things that you have to do when you come to a new country is get a job. So what I found interesting out of that Dana Wagner segment was her kind of dispelling some of those myths that are very common to the narrative what we hear here over in the West, which would be that refugees will kind of come and threaten or take jobs from people who are native to that country. Is that a common narrative that you hear over in Australia?
Absolutely, I think we're hearing the same thing. I don't know whether it's true or not though, because in a lot of cases there are jobs in different fields that do exist, and I find that especially for younger refugees, maybe people our age, there are definitely jobs that we don't particularly want to do, which they absolutely could. I mean, it's not ideal. A lot of them, as we found out with Haney, a lot of them come out and they're like fully degree educated. But to begin with, it's all about kind of making money and just starting a new life. So there are plenty of jobs in specific fields, and that's especially evident in Shepparton in regional Victoria. And Shepparton is a small country town located 180 kilometres north of Melbourne. With its long migration history and strong agricultural infrastructure, the town is unique in its approach to new arrivals. The manager of the Ethnic Council of Shepparton, Chris Hazelman, speaks about several issues which all refugees encounter during their early settlement period in Australia.
In some quarters there'd be some apprehension, some hesitation, because mostly speaking, the previous groups that have come have tended to look a lot like us, whereas the more recent arrivals certainly don't. And a lot of the research and study shows that more visible communities, whether that's through skin colour or dress, do tend to have a more difficult settlement experience, whereas some of the older groups could, figuratively speaking, blend into the rest of the community. If you've looked briefly at the people that we employ here, our own staff members, they don't blend into the community. They stand out. But I think because of the long history here in Shepparton, despite those differences, I think we just tend to take it for granted that there will be people from other communities and other cultures as part of the Shepparton community. And if Shepparton's history teaches us anything, is that sooner or later there's another new arrival community on the horizon. It might be Karen from Burma, it might be another African community, it might be some of the Syrians that are coming to Australia. They will, the history has been, and this is with the Sudanese and Afghanis, that one or two families will arrive and through word of mouth, this is a good place. Next minute, you've got 5 families, 10 families, 20. It grows. So maybe next fruit season, there'll be a couple of families from another community. They'll talk to others and the cycle will go off again. I don't think, unless there's a dramatic change in the regional economy, I don't think that's going to alter in any way.
The global city.
The global city. The global city. The global city.
Local voices, international perspectives.
So Rebecca, seeing that segment, it makes me wonder what's more beneficial for refugees. Is it for them to come to a smaller town or to go to a big city? What do you think about that?
I think that's a really interesting question. In the initial settlement period, I would tend to think that the smaller towns are actually better, because they're not going to get lost in the huge kind of metropolis of all the different communities, whereas if you come into a small town, in a lot of cases there's already existing refugee communities there and a more close sort of support network, as opposed to a big city.
Yeah, as proven by Shepparton. It's undeniable, though, that the influx of refugees has raised certain security concerns, in some circles. Syria is a high-risk country that not only because of the years of conflict, but due to the visible presence of terrorist organizations.
Recent attacks around the world have the international community on high alert. Many are wondering what governments are doing to keep radicalized people out.
This is a complex and sensitive issue, so we've brought in an expert from Ryerson University.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we'd like to welcome Aaron Kislenko to the studio.
Hi.
Thanks so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
Dr. Kislenko is a professor and undergraduate program director in the history department here at Ryerson. He has also worked as a senior officer with Canada Immigration at Toronto Pearson International Airport. Dr. Kislenko has dealt with many high-profile national security cases. So he's an excellent guest to have for this topic.
Yes.
Let's see about that. Yeah.
So where we want to start is to just ask you, should people be concerned?
I mean, sure. I'd say in general, I wish Canadians were more interested and involved in their immigration, system by and large and knew more about it. So yeah, of course, people need to be concerned. I think it's, sort of silly that people say, there's never a problem, and when the government's come out and said, we've got everything under control, that's just patently false. I mean, the nature of any system is such that there's always going to be loopholes, there's always going to be mistakes being made. So there is cause for concern. That being said, what's been sort of presented in the media in particular, and by some members of Canadian society, and by some countries to the south of us, is ludicrous and it's offensive, right? And I think Canadians need to stand back and take a breath and understand that, immigration system and refugees in particular, is a fundamental of Canadian society, right? It's not negotiable. You can't sort of talk, as if we accept multiculturalism and, help everybody in the world and really believe in these issues, and then turn around and sort of divorce yourself from that proposition. That's not how civil society works. So even as one who policed against that and, dealt with bad guys all the time, the reality is that we need to adhere to our value system a lot more. And this is really, I think, something that's missing. So when people talk about the security concerns, they fail to understand there are protocols in place, and that even if some get through, and I know it sounds dramatic, but even if some get through and blow something up, as terrible and as monumental as that would be, to me personally, it's more about honoring the value systems that we have as a civil society and helping those in desperate need of our help. With, of course, the proviso that we are checking them as much as we can and that we're restrained, right? I think sometimes Canadians live in a fairy tale where they imagine that everybody who says they're a refugee is, or everybody who comes to our shores is, totally benign and innocent. So as long as we have protocols in place and examine the situation with that in mind, I think we can and should achieve a balance, and that's what's sort of missing in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. How good of a job do you think that they're doing right now for the screening process?
They being us, like being Canadian officers and people. Yeah. So and I'm not going to be political here, but the previous government did an absolutely horrific job in setting up protocols overseas. It's just you can't argue otherwise. They didn't send anybody. So this isn't something you can do remotely. You need staff on the ground. They need to be placed in Jordan, in Turkey, right? Not in Iraq and Syria. That's impossible. That's dangerous. They didn't send anybody. So you need folks on the ground. You need considerable resources. We've deployed them far too late, and the Trudeau government is being extraordinarily optimistic in assuming that you can do it 25,000 by February. And that's, a mechanical issue, and Canadians, again, don't know enough about, anything involved in the system. So they somehow imagine that you send a bunch of people over and then, wait at the border and shake hands as people drag themselves into neighboring countries. That's not how it works. The protocols are in depth. In this particular circumstance, they're incomplete because neither the Syrian or Iraqi government are participant, so they can't release police records. We don't have adequate checks. So a lot of that stuff is going to be, more problematic than we imagine. And we're far behind many other countries. Canada has, frankly, a dismal record on this, which again goes against the grain of Canadians being so proud about our policies. What I'm particularly concerned about is that as media has shown, a lot of the people making their way into Europe are not really from Syria and Iraq.
I know in Australia, a lot of people that come here, they don't come with any documentation, so it's almost impossible to know who these people really are. So I'm just wondering how exactly Canada goes about verifying the identity of people coming.
Maybe I'll put it into perspective. That's regular. Like, this is where Canadians, and maybe Australians too, I don't know, but are really naive. Like, people routinely show up at Canadian airports. That's what I dealt with for 12 years, and land border points with no documents whatsoever. So they could tell you they're Mickey Mouse, and you got to work on that premise, right? So this is a particularly, remarkable circumstance because we can see them fleeing from, really, high pressure areas, volatile areas. So you have to take them at statements. Many people are grabbing because they're smart and they realize they're not coming back anytime soon. They're grabbing every last stick of paper imaginable to substantiate their identity. But yeah, there's going to be lots of times where we don't have it. So under law, what Canadians can do, and it does apply overseas in this case, you can hold people. It's going to be tricky in foreign countries to enact a detention. But here in Canada, you can hold people, for a period of time under judicial review to substantiate their identity, right? Make them get documents, do background checks, and so on. These circumstances much different. So the best you can do is, with whatever documents they have, whatever personal statements they have, is to make in effect, a kind of gut decision on people, which is why you've noticed that the government has decided to kind of cut its losses and focus principally on families, with the novel idea that people with kids aren't good terrorists or something like that, right? And that's a kind of crass judgment. It's not true, but it is an operative assessment based on the fact that people just won't have documents. So rather than take a risk with young guys who meet the criteria of radicals in the Islamic State, much better than families do, they're cutting their losses. And then we'll let them in and then ask them to substantiate identity after the fact. And when Canadians hear this, they get all panicked. I've heard people go, well, that's outrageous. And I look at them and say, that's what the system's been forever. That's what I did every day of my life, is to deal with people with no documents and then release them into the general public.
Do you feel that there's any other common misconceptions? Because you said people come with that and you have the response back. Are there any other common misconceptions that you hear that you would like to
I love that question. How many hours do you have? And I'm sure Australians are no different, to be candid with you. Most Western democracies know precious little about what the immigration system actually involves and what refugee determination in particular involves. So yeah, I hate to sound callous, but the vast majority of Canadians hear the word refugees and conjure up images of bloated bellies and hollow eyes and people that you imagine because you see them on Sunday morning commercials. That, at least at land border and airport borders in Canada, those are not the people that we see, ever, because they can't get out. They die. They don't have documents. They get tortured, murdered. And that's where I get upset with Canadians, because they're engaging in a really destructive fantasy, right? They imagine themselves to be helping people that do not get our help. This is a different circumstance because we have an opportunity to help people fleeing a very obvious conflict zone. But even still, I think Canadians need to understand that huge numbers of people are not getting out. They have no means and they die. And then, yeah, in that exodus, there are going to be some people that are going to be problematic for us, even if they're not members of the Islamic State. They may have criminal backgrounds. They may be politically affiliated with the regime, right? We've seen that repeatedly. Like in Rwanda, after the genocide, lots of Rwandan perpetrators of the genocide fled. So that's what you get in a refugee system. And Canadians suffer from terrible naivety, assuming that everybody who comes here is genuine, tells the truth. Really novel Canadian sort of notions, right? I think Australians probably suffer from that, less than we do, and Americans even less. But so those are misconceptions. But equally perverse is the conception that every single person in this exodus is a terrorist or a potential terrorist.
Thank you so much. That's been very illuminating, considering we are naive.
You look shocked. Yeah, no, I'm happy to help.
I'd like to thank you so much for being our guest on the
pleasure.
show.
Thank you for taking the time to come in.
Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear the differences and the similarities between Australia and Canada, and to hear the kind of the perspective about naivety and what the public really does and doesn't know about the situation.
Good. You're welcome.
The global city.
The global city. The global city.
Local voices, international perspectives.
You've been watching The Global City. We produce shows with universities around the world, streaming our video signals through the internet. So Rebecca, we've had a great conversation so far. We're really happy that you're able to join us for this show. And we're just wondering if you have any closing thoughts or anything else you want to add to this conversation that we've been having.
Thanks for having me. Not particularly. I just think it's really interesting to see the comparison between the two countries. There's obviously a lot of similarities, but I certainly haven't seen the same level of transparency from our government compared to yours. I mean, the Toronto Star ran that page the other day saying, "Welcome to Canada," with the Islamic writing at the bottom. There's been none of that. There's really been no talk about what's happened since the first arrivals came in November. We have no idea what's going on at this stage because I think public discourse has now shifted to kind of talk about issues of national security and terrorism as opposed to the humanitarian aid crisis that we're having.
I think for me, just one thing that I would want to add is that I feel like no one would leave their homeland if it wasn't for a good reason. You know, one of our professors here a few weeks ago had given us this poem. She sent it to us over email, and there was this. It was written by a Syrian woman who had fled her country, and one of the lines from the poem was something along the lines of, you know, no parent would put their child on a raft and, you know, into these unknown waters to go into this unknown land. Unless the waters was safer than the land where they originally were. And that poem, I remember that one line really stayed with me. And I think it's something that we really need to remember.
Yeah, in terms of staying compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to visit our website at theglobalcity.org, where you can watch the full-length versions of the stories you've seen on our show.
We'll also be putting up some ways you can get involved in helping with this crisis.
Whether it's lending volunteer translation services or donating a winter coat, there are many opportunities to help the new Syrian Canadians.
Likewise, in Australia, there are several organisations through which you can support the new arrivals. No matter where we live in the world today, today's show illustrates that the humanitarian refugee crisis affects everyone to varying degrees.
Thank you for tuning in to The Global City on Global Campus Network.
From the University of Queensland in Australia, I'm Rebecca Powell.
And from Ryerson University in Canada, I'm Katie Raskina.
And I'm Charlotte Arnold. Goodbye.